The sea lifted and breathed like a great, sleeping beast, long coils of swell rising under the hull and slipping away toward the shoals and the black island ahead. In the low light before dawn, water and sky wore the same iron hue, a boundary guessed rather than seen. Spray came up in fine mist and laid itself along the rails and ropes and faces in a clammy sheen. A gull cried once, thin and unbelieving, and then fell silent before the larger quiet that hung over the approach to the old volcanic mountain that had been made into a fortress before memory had quickened the first stories about it. Jon stood toward the prow and watched the island hold its ground. In the north the shores ran away and came again in gentler forms. Dunes and stone headlands thick with wind-crooked pines and stunted birches, cliffs raw but softened with lichen and grass. Dragonstone permitted no softness. Its cliffs were sheer seams of black glass and porous stone, fluted and bitten by the old fires that had boiled up and hardened, like the bones under a scar. Above those cliffs the fortress had grown out of the same rock, or had been convinced of it. The castle's lower works appeared to have flowed and frozen, bulwarks poured in dark ribbons, parapets knuckled out from layered basalt. Even the dragons along the ridges and gargoyles sat like things petrified mid-stride, caught by a god's hard breath and left fixed. Wind whispered along the short hairs at the back of his neck through the gaps of the hood he had pulled up. He had learned long ago not to trust to the warmth of furs in damp cold. Dry meant strength. Damp seeped like doubt and ate it away. He put his left hand around a stay and felt old tar and salt. The old knight had a scarf wound high around his neck so that only his nose and eyes were visible. Those eyes did not blink much. We'll cut a little nearer the headland and ride it in. Hard early means easy late. Jon nodded. He had learned to let the sea teach him by the man's mouth. If there were gods in the water, Davos knew their moods. He had not slept, or he might have, but it had been the sort of rest that leaves the mind turning while the body lies inert. He had stood and sat and walked the deck through the dark and listened to the ship's timbers. Once the night had opened and showed the slow fire that lay in clouds behind the horizon, the faintest green veils. Men told stories of lights in the northern sky and of omens, and of the dead that could not warm themselves by any fire. That had been another shore and another cold. He had lived inside it for a time that had made other places feel imagined. Thought enough to sink us if we could stack it, Davos said, with a twist of humor he didn't often give himself. If thought had weight, we'd have been on the bottom before we left White Harbor, Jon answered, and the old knight's eyelines creased in a way that could almost pass for a smile. The crew moved with quiet economy. There were not many of them, and most were not fighting men. They had learned to lift and haul together anyway, the way people do when they know the cost of doing it badly. A boy with a red wool cap too large for his head worked a coil as though he took counsel from it. A woman with scars across one cheek braced her boots and paid out line, testing each inch with her hands before letting it go. The sea insisted on exactness. It permitted nearly as little error as a blade held to a throat. Jon watched the line of the tide as it curled and straightened around the rocks, watched the deviation of foam threads in the long swell, the riffle where submerged stone shouldered up beneath it. All this was unfamiliar coast, and yet the watching of it was known. He had studied too many movements of too many things he did not control to forget the way of looking. The habit of it had been made part of him north of a wall and stretched thin across a barren world until it had seemed as if he might fall through. He had not. It wasn't courage. It was a stubbornness born of a promise that nobody else could carry. He put his hand in the pocket of the old black cloak that had come with him through ice and blood and salt and cold and found the folded letters again. He did not take them out. Sometimes he read them, sometimes he felt them and knew their contents without seeing the words. He had no memory now of the script on their faces, of the crookedness of the writing, of the places where a blot had spread. He only knew he carried his questions and his right both sealed in those folds, and that paper does better in a pocket than in a sea. "Look there," Davos said low and pointed. A flame winked and guttered and then was nursed up again. A lantern on a hook near the base of the cliff. It showed a small landing carved into the stone and a stair that went up, steep as a ladder, with iron poles set into the rock to fight the wind. There was no harbor of any courtesy. The island had not been dressed to welcome anyone. It had been designed to test and to warn. The flame bowed with the gusts and righted itself again, stubborn even while it bled heat into the mist. "No banner," Jon said. "Not in fog, you wouldn't see it if there were," Davos replied. "But I'd expect a color. Nothing is nothing. That's a kind of speech too." The ship eased in. Men put out long poles, and the woman with the scar called and the boy with the too large cap echoed, and the others listened as if the sea might answer. The keel kissed rock and drew away. 2 lines went ashore and bit into iron rings set in stone. The tide shouldered them and grumbled. The lantern sitter, a broad figure wrapped in heavy wool, watched without wave or shout and then tipped the flame alit. Blew toward them, as if in the making of a blessing. "You'd think they were expecting us," Davos said, the dryness back. "They know the sea around them," Jon replied. "Everything that moves stands out on a quiet night." He drew his hood closer to keep the fine cold off his ears. The line from the starboard gunwale creaked, tightened, and held. "I'll go ashore first," Davos said. "If they want to spit and argue before they learn but after they see, better they do it at an old man who looks like he's smuggled half the world's fish guts in his time, and not at a young lord who looks like he could take offense." "The young lord is not taking offense," Jon said. Davos snorted, a fog of breath. "No, you're thinking about what taking means. That's the danger and the safety in you both." He went down into the sway of the rope ladder with a steadiness that did not look his age and landed as the next swell lifted. He spoke to the lantern keeper in a low voice. The voices came back across stone and water, thin and stripped by the air. Jon could hear nothing of the content but could tell the measure of it by the way both men stood. Not angry, not welcoming, weighing each word for the metal inside it. Then, with a small gesture, the lantern keeper stepped aside and fixed the hook higher and steadied the ladder. Jon went after, boots slicked with dew and salt. The rock was pitted and black and bit back at the leather. Above, the stair ran too steep for comfort and surprisingly dry. The wind up there would have scraped snow from it without pity. Perhaps the island's breath warmed it from within. The thought came unbidden and then made itself at home, as if the place might have humors like a body, heat that came and went, moods set by old churning. At the top of the more cruel part of the stair, they reached a small platform hacked from the cliffside and railed against gusts. The keeper set the lantern on a bracket there. He was half again as wide as Davos and thick through the shoulder. Snow clung to the hair that pushed from his hood. He had a face like a weathered fence post and gray eyes that had looked at one thing for too long and had taken its color, the way a man's hands take the stain of what he handles. "Ser Davos Seaworth," he said. The words landed with surprise mostly scoured off them, but not all. He had not expected to say that name, and yet he had known it when it came to him. "I saw you stand beside the king they made in this place, and then I heard you were dead in the north." "Often flattered," Davos said. "Seldom accurate." He gestured a hand. "This one's nobility is what he makes of it, and he means to make of it something that does not sour the mouth. He needs to set his feet where his right says he should. You're the man to say whether he can put them here without blood washing them first. And you are the man to make such a request as if it were a question about the weather." The keeper's eyes considered Jon. He saw the northern bone that did not blend easily, the length that was made from winters, the face that had been told to be still too many times. He saw the way Jon did not avert his gaze nor push it forward. Men learn to place their eyes when they have something to carry. "Do you keep the gate for Dragonstone?" Jon asked. "I keep the lantern, I keep the stair, I keep the names of the men who go up and come down," the man said. "There is a castellan above and a maester who reads the crows and a few dozen who say they are soldiers until you ask them to do a soldier's work in cold rain. There are women and children who do what they always have: clean, fix, carry, prepare, remember. We have not been paid honest coin since the king they made left to march north for a cause that sent more bones to the deep and to the forest than any tally has been taken of. We have been told to hold. We have held. If you mean to take, you will say it plain." "I mean to claim what is mine by birth," Jon answered. I mean to ask those who sit here to hear what proof there is to hear, and to make a choice that gives them a place to stand when the next storms come." The Lantern Keeper's mouth moved into the beginnings of something and then back again. "Birth," he said, tasting the word. "That is a thing too many men have claimed on this rock. Every one of them bled in the asking. Sometimes it was theirs after for a time. Only the rock endures." He took up the lantern again and bent his head into the wind. "Go up the rest. Keep your hand on the iron. Men who are too proud to hold these rails tend to go over. The sea does not care what their names were." The stair turned inward and then out along another face of the cliff where the wind shouldered at them harder. Jon kept his hand on the cold rail and set his feet with care. His cloak fluttered like a bird that could not find purchase and wanted to be rid of the body it caught upon. When they reached the path that wound along the base of the lower wall, the wind dropped as though smothered by the bulk of stone above, and his ears rang with the sudden absence. They went beneath an arch that smelled of old ash and oiled metal. The courtyard within was broader than he had expected and older. Snow had dusted the paving stones and lay gathered in the seams like script. A circle of low buildings leaned inward around a central well. A handful of men in patched mail and heavy cloaks watched them come. A little boy ran up with a bucket and took a long look at Jon, and then at the sword at Jon's hip, and then at his boots, and then fled toward the stable door as if he had been scouting and could now bring back a report of weight. The castellan stood under an eave where a dragon's head projected out of the stone so that it could watch the yard with eternal disinterest. The man was old in the way that had hardened into the simplest shapes, stooped and narrow, all planes and no curve. He had a beard that had gone to chalk, and cheeks that held their call, or like old fruit, and eyes that moved as if they once trained on moving water and had not forgotten it. "Ser Davos," he said when they had come near. His voice had been left too long in dry barrels. "Dragonstone does not receive kings any longer. It receives crows and messages that forget themselves on the page, and shortages and complaints, and old soldiers who know the steps and feel obliged to climb them again. What have you brought me?" "I've brought you a young man who has walked through the places where other men insist they would not go, and who has been told who he is and does not shrug it off as a pretty story. He asks to be heard. He asks to put his name into these stones. And he brings those things that turn talk to more than talk." Davos tipped his chin at Jon's pocket. The castellan looked as if he had long since lost patience with the drama of men pulling folded paper from their clothing and acting as if the gods had written there. Yet he made a small gesture, and a boy from the well set his bucket down and turned his head so as not to be too watching, and the men at the eaves shifted their weight, and some of them were wearing swords that had rust like freckles. All of them felt the weather shift even if the wind had not. The island had an old way of listening. Jon took out the packet without flourish. He had been taught 100 times not to give too much shape to any single moment. He had died once at the wrong moment and learned that time stops for no one, and certainly not for weight given to words. He set the papers on a flat stone that jutted from the wall like the shelf of a shrine. Davos reached inside his own cloak and drew out another folded thing. This one sealed with a rough lump of wax broken long ago and resealed with a different device. Davos did not say where these had come to his hands. Jon knew. Davos was a current that carried what it must when it must, and he did not call attention to the iron bars he slipped past. A man in gray came from the shadows with the measured step and watchful hands of a maester. He had thin hair that he had not given up combing. He had eyes that shifted quickly without ever appearing to move. He was one of those men who spend a life with parchment and then smell like it. He set down a bundle of keys as if it weighed more than anything else he carried and took up the papers. He read in silence. He did not breathe more loudly when he reached certain sentences. Men who learn to read for state and judgment teach their face to go still, but the eyes say much. His eyes said he had recognized signatures. They said he had found names written where names had not been expected. They said he had come to that eternal moment when the story a man tells about himself and the story a page tells about him shake hands awkwardly. When he lifted his gaze to Jon, it had changed, but only for men who notice such small weather, and this courtyard was full of such men. "We have had crows come from the north," the maester said. "We are not ignorant that some things are not as all thought they were. Old truths are being taken up and found to be clothes that never suited. But he says, he looked again at the last page and seemed to choose against giving the word sound. It is not only this. Men have pretended to truths written in hands that looked right. Last season a woman arrived with a boy she called Prince and a set of letters that had been done so well a lesser I would have bowed to them. And what did you see? Davos asked. The maester's mouth twitched, as if he did not want to flatter himself and could not help it. I saw a T that was not crossed the way I know it has been crossed by the same hand for 20 years. I saw a puffiness in the vellum where bad wax had taken the first impression. I saw that the boy had the eyes of a man who had never sailed in his life and yet called the wind's angles as if born to them. The lies were poor when they didn't know they were lying. But the letters were skillful, and the skillful lie is always a temptation for tired men. And now, Davos asked, and now I see that certain names are coupled and corroborated, and that if this is a forgery it is a work that would have demanded the attention of men whose attention is busy on other things than unmaking one young man. If this is a forgery, the world is even more made of lies than I had granted in my blackest moment. He looked at Jon again. I do not say what I wish to be true. I say what looks to be. Men in rooms better than this will test it again and not be as courteous as I am. But I will not throw you down the stairs. The Castellan had not taken his eyes from Jon for a long time. They were sea eyes. They conserved motion for when it mattered. The husband of the light in the north did many things he didn't understand in hopes of winning something he assured himself he did. He left this place with more faith than provisions. Some of the men here still believe their knees ache because they knelt for him too long. Some believe their bellies ache because they stayed too long waiting for someone else's wages. I have to mind both aches. If I admit you, I am not making you lord. I'm making you guest. If you are lord in truth, the place will teach us that at its leisure, the way tide teaches a man he cannot outwait it. Jon nodded. I didn't expect any other courtesy. He looked around the yard. He could feel the mountain beneath his feet even under stone and mortar. It was the sensation a man gets when he stands on ice that is thick enough to hold him but living just the same subtle movement, faint sound, the idea of a breath under him. Is there dragonglass still in the tunnels? He asked. It was not a question that men here were asked often. Heads turned. The maester's eyes cut to Davos, then to Jon. Some, he said. Not much is carried up. It breaks, and no one here eats with knife tips made of glass. The tunnels go in places they shouldn't. Men tell stories they should reserve for winter nights and children with strong blankets. The last lord who made much of the black stone carried his men so deep they came back with a silence that took weeks to wash off them. My men have faces that look like theirs, Jon said. We won't carry stories up. We'll carry stone. We'll need it for spearheads and knives. There are battles coming that do not pay attention to whose banners fly in whose yard. Banners pay for food, the Castellan said. But if you bring up stone and set men to that work, you set a new tide in motion. I wonder if I can stop it after. What you make and what you become will not be undone by a new letter. We cannot speak to that tide as if there were no other tide, the maester added. You ask about glass, and I think of those ships that will come for salt and news. You ask about glass, and I think of neighbors who will begin to tell each other they smell dragons again. And when men begin to speak of dragons, they begin to remember many favors and outrages, and they use those memories as they like. Some will sail here with their hands out. Some will sail with their hands closed around shafts. Jon waited. He was learning again the patience of a place. Winterfell had a way of listening. The wall had a way of denying. This island had a way of weighing. After a long moment he bowed his head, not deeply, and not as a supplicant, but as a man marking that he stood before something old. I didn't come to set halls on fire, he said. I came to put my name in the rock in the only manner that makes a name more than noise, by doing what the place and time require. The first requirement is dragonglass. The second is food. The third is men who know who they are when the wind takes the banners down and the fires go out. The Castellan's mouth might have softened. It might have simply tired. You speak like a man who has slept in armor and buried men he receipts in his sleep, he said. You speak like someone born to know comfort and told later there had been a palace waiting. The gods like little jokes. He lifted a hand. Open dormitory 6. Put fires in the grates. The rooms above the kitchens are warm tonight, and the rooms along the leeward wall have windows that let the snow in. Let the Northmen sleep where the sea is quiet. They went under another arch and into a passage that had been cut by hands that had known they were working inside a mountain that must be persuaded. The stairs turned. The air warmed. Jon felt it on his cheeks. He tasted sulfur faintly. The breath of the island was unmistakable now. An old animal dozing, sometimes turning, sometimes letting a little heat leak out. He had lived on ice that sang and cracked. He had ridden with men whose breath looked like smoke. He had died under cold hands. The warm stones startled him more than cold. Davos walked next to him with his head half turned like a watchman. "Feels like I never left," he said simply. If there was grief in it, he did not take it out and show it. They came to a hall where the roof came down in low arches as if they were the interior bones of a whale, and a series of rooms opened one into another. Men carried in bedrolls and set them at the corners against drafts. A fat woman with narrow eyes and a keen mouth set her fists on her hips and looked the northerners over without saying a word, and then turned toward a subordinate and began to speak a list of food and comforts that one could tell had been devised at the expense of small luxuries for years. A pot of mussels pounded with herbs, a loaf of bread split and toasted on both sides to take the drippings, thin stew with whatever bones could be made to give up something more. She glanced once at Jon, measuring whether he would insist on a place above or sit where he was told. He gave her back the look that promises to obey the house until the house invites him to alter it. She nodded once and carried on. In the room assigned to him, the floor sloped gently toward a drain hole set in the corner, as if the room remembered flooding from an ancient time. The hearth along the wall was deep as a grave. There were iron hooks above it, perhaps for pots, perhaps for other things once. A small window looked across a courtyard into stone. Snow was falling in lazy flakes that lasted for a time in the air like arranged dancers, and then sudden flockings blew them to an edge and they disappeared in a second. He put his hand to the wall and felt the warmth again. There was comfort and warning in it both. It was the kind of warmth a man might tell himself would last and be disappointed by the next hour. He took off his gloves and laid them on the hook near the fire. They smoked a little. He had not understood how thoroughly the damp had stolen into them. He stood over the hearth and remembered another hearth, and the smell of leather and wet dog and soup and earth, and a woman's voice singing not for him but for the work itself, and a man's laugh that did not need permission. "You can have the long room at your back whenever you ask for it," Davos said from the doorway. "They keep the table covered when there's no lord here, because the air tries to change wood to stone in this place." His mouth twitched again. "Take one look and you'll know why they cover it." "I'll go after we eat," Jon said. He did not want to go to the great table on an empty stomach. The map that was a room must be looked at without hunger taking part in the thinking. While they waited for food, he read a letter again by the hearth. It had been written at a place where dinners ran to 2 courses too many and concern for people's lives was treated, according to old habit, as a sport and a calculation. It had been written by a man who had read older writing and said he had found those neat little lies that are all the more convincing because a mind trained to tidy and list them speaks them. It had also been written by someone who shared his bread and confessed his terror and had watched a friend die and had studied what truth would let itself be held. Letters are often written by 2 men at once, the one who wishes to persuade and the one who wishes to not be seen wanting anything. Jon had learned to hear both. He refolded it and slid it back into his cloak and thought about a tower with a room that had known too much blood for birthing to be any kind of sanctuary, and a woman's face he had never seen and would never see except inside expressions other people insisted took after hers. Names had weight. He was learning where to carry his. He was learning how to put it down when it got in the way of the one thing he knew, that the living, even those who had done harm and those who did not deserve grace, must be protected from what would devour them without caring about any deserts. Dinner came in earthenware glazed in dull, chipping blues and browns. The mussels had been bullied out of their shells and softened with herbs. He did not know an onion roasted so long it had surrendered all its temper to sweet comfort. The bread was dense and smoked where it had touched iron. There was a thin stew that had a bare thread of fat and a flavor like bones that had been put on to simmer in mid-morning and still had something to give by night. Men ate with care for rationing without making a show of it. The fat woman took station at the kitchen door and kept a ledger on a slate that she wiped with the hem of her apron. She would have taken on a king like she took on a barrel, assessing, deciding where to roll it to, telling it without words whether it was of use or in the way. After, he went with Davos to the long, low room where a cloth had been laid over something at once too ordinary and too strange. Only 2 candles had been lit, as if the act wanted witness but not attention. The maester was there with a basket of rolled papers tucked under one arm. He had the look of a man who had persuaded himself to a position he would defend, and had placed every argument where he could reach it, and meant to be defeated by his own fairness or nothing. "Here we are," the maester said without preface. He drew the cloth aside as a priest might. The table underneath was not like any table, and of course like every table that had ever held the shape of a realm. The coastline of a continent ran along the grain, mountain chains rose in perspective as delicate ridges, the rivers were hinted in grooves, capes and bays reached like hands. The islands were where they ought to be. The north sat cooler to the eye even though the wood had no temperature. And there, above all, the black island on which they stood jutted out at the bottom of the map like a thumb, flexible in the mind if not in truth, touching and withdrawing from the mainland at the mercy of mist and current. Jon put his hand on the carved place that stood for the North's heart and then drew it back. He did not want to handle it with dirty fingers the way a man does not want to touch a name that belongs to someone else with hands that have had to do too much work. He put his palm to the table's edge and felt the smoothness there where tens of thousands of hands had smoothed it. The secret in craft is that it asks for a small worship of touch. Long hands teach wood what to become. "People will say this table makes men mad," the maester said conversationally, as if giving the warning of a good host about a low lintel. "They will say whoever sits here begins to believe he can move what cannot be moved. They will say the table makes the men believe themselves to be gods. People like to blame objects," Davos said mildly. "The table sat while men put other men to the torch and called it law." Jon slid his gaze, measuring distances as if by habit. He had learned to count yards on snow and to judge the weight of men in a charge. The scale of this map was different, but the habit kept pace. He saw the long journey from White Harbor to here traced with a finger in the air, the bluffs and the ports and the towns that made their living face toward the sea. He saw the stormlands thrown up as a wall before the ship-torn coasts. He saw the eastern stepstones scattered like the chips of an old king's tooth. He saw driftmark and claw isle near enough that a swift ship might visit both and return before a day had spent itself. And he understood that nothing here was ever done without someone over there hearing of it in the same day. "It has stood for many oaths," the maester said, laying a hand gently on one corner as if to calm it. "Inspiration has a way of making men's voices louder when they are at this table. Whisperers whisper less, and men who shout remember the shape of shouts and forget the lungs. It is also a good place for writing letters." "I will have to write many," Jon said. He was tired of the work of persuasion, but persuasion was less tiring than the burial of the unpersuadable. "First to the north. They have a right to know what claim I lay in a southern place. To tell them why you are not with them," Davos said. The man did not soften necessary sentences. "Yes," Jon said. "To tell them why a wolf stands on a dragon's rock and does not feel false doing it." The fat woman came in with more candles and set them without fuss. Light slid along the carved mountains. The effect was of sunrise running west, then east, then back again like time manipulated by a bored god. The smell of tallow put a little comfort in the air that the sulfur had denied. "Maester," Jon said, "what can you tell me of the mines?" The man shifted, brought one paper to the top of his bundle. "Tunnels run beneath the mountain like the veins beneath a wounded man," he said, dropping into cadenced recitation because the subject soothed him. "Some are old and have doorways carved with faces that look more like men than dragons and more like dragons than men. Some are newer and were hacked in the last generation so roughly that they look as if a bear with a toothache made them. The glass lies in pockets and flows. Flows, do you hear? As if it were frozen liquid, of course it is, and chooses to lie in eddies rather than in straight runs. Many men claim to know how to find it. Most of them are liars. Old Hob is not. He shuffled again. We have 4 baskets of shards in storage and 32 points suitable for knives if you are not picky about knives. We have no spearheads that I would put in a man's hand if I liked him. I will like many men, Jon said. We need spearheads. We need picks and hands and rope. We need to make sure that when we go down and come back up we bring more with us than stories. The maester looked up and seemed to engage with the man rather than the idea. You think I am a teller of stories? He said, not offended, nearly amused. I am the keeper of what they cost. You can have the miners if you can pay them, or if you can persuade them that death behind a long wall is worse than risk under the mountain. Pay is not always coin here. Food buys, security buys, names that hold. The men here have knelt until their knees complain in their dreams. If you give them chance to stand for something without kneeling to it, they'll take that pay and run through fire. Jon thought about kneeling. He had done it. He had sworn to. He had also stood alone. The proper shape for a vow is not always falling to the ground. Sometimes it is standing until the legs shake. The heat from the room's hearth made his eyes heavy for a moment. He blinked it back. We'll go down at first light, he said. Not with half the castle, with a small party. I want to see the way with my own eyes. If I'm to send men, I'll know what I send them to. You'll want a guide, the maester said. His fingers plucked at a list. Old Hob, if we can drag him up from his cups. He says he drinks because it keeps the voices from getting loud. I say he drinks because it keeps his wife, who has been dead for 11 years, from being too quiet. Hob's voice carries like a bell in those tunnels. He's not stealthy. That may be a virtue or not. You'll want rope. We have rope. You'll want a lantern that will not blow out in a sigh. We have 1 or 2. I'll want men who don't startle with their own breath in their ears, Jon said. Davos, put the word for 8. Tell them not to pray too hard before they go to sleep. Let them keep their prayers in their pockets to use like knives if the dark asks favors. Davos nodded. He had the gift of moving away as if the space wanted him to go where he went. Some men have to push through their own air. The old knight slipped through it. The maester hesitated. There was more. And letters, he said. We cannot wait to tell the island who sits in its rooms. The more men who hear the news from someone with a good hand, the less they will fill it in with their own. You need to tell Driftmark. You need to tell Claw Isle. You need to tell the mainland. And you need to decide whether you will write Jon Snow of Winterfell or something else besides. It was the thing that had come with him like a breathing creature and lay down at his feet no matter where he went. He had been given a name once that had felt like a borrowed coat. He had carried it so long it became his skin. Then someone in a distant place with a candle and a stack of binding told him that, in fact, there was a silk shirt beneath, and the coat had hidden it. Now men wanted to know whether he would strip the coat before they believed the shirt existed. I am Jon, he said. If I write Jon Targaryen, it will not make a dead man get up or a living one kneel who has found a reason not to. If I write Snow, the men who hate will still hate, and the men who want to pull will try to pull me off balance whether there's a different name or not. I will sign what is necessary to make letters go where they must. And I will answer to what I am called by the men whose lives I am bound to safeguard. I won't argue with mouths about the letter. I will argue with time and with hunger. The maester smiled then, a small, surprised thing, as if he had found a book he had assumed was badly bound to be in fact well made. So, he said, what a relief. After they left, the room kept its candle breath and the table waited, and it had been waiting and would wait, and would listen to other arguments and suffer other men's elbows and suffer to be drummed upon by hands that could not keep still under the press of thought. The map had the patience of wood. The island had the patience of stone. Jon had learned patience by being denied kindness by men for years. That does not make patience pleasant. It only makes it possible. He dreamt badly. He did not dream of dragons breathing fire or of kings with silver hair proclaiming him from a balcony. He dreamt of a door that opened in a wet wall and of cold air rolling over someone's belly and of the sound that is not a cry and not breath and that a man cannot forget once he hears it in a place wrong for babies. He woke with the smell of the island in his nostrils, sulfur and salt, and the ache in his hands of someone who had been clenching them for too long. He did not go back to sleep. He sat by the empty hearthstones and listened to the shift of heat in the walls. He might as well have been listening to the sea. At first light, he and Davos and 6 men went to the miner's entrance, which was at the back of a narrow passage behind the kitchen. The fat woman glared at them for tracking damp on her clean stones and shoved a heel of stale bread into Jon's hand with such force that he nearly dropped it. "You take something in with you," she said. "It fools the old spirits into thinking you do not need anything from them. Never go empty-handed. It is how sin starts." Hob was waiting outside the iron door, a squat man with a face so weathered it looked like bark, deep cracks, eyes like new teeth set in them, a nose that had been broken too many times and then visited by drink so often it had surrendered and turned red for good. He grinned at Jon with the shamelessness of a man who had already lived through being disliked by many. His grin showed a single tooth like a little stone set in pink. "You're the Lord," Hob said. "Or you're the Pretender. Either one's fine for me. I only need a man who can tell other men to carry out the baskets instead of letting them sit by the door until a woman trips over them. You can do that trick and I'll call you the king of the smoke holes for all I mind." "I can do that trick," Jon said. Hob's grin grew. "Ah, you got a voice properly fit to echo. The tunnels hear you and answer back with the same tone. Whisper in and you'll get whispers out. Shout in and the mountain will fall on your head to teach you not to shout." He patted the iron latch with the kind of affection other men save for a dog. "You respect me, I'll respect you," he told the door. "We've known each other longer than any lord. We talk pleasant. Keep our ends." Inside was a smell like knives. Obsidian has a way of letting air know it has been sharp once and could be again. Pricks the nose. The lanterns threw light that seemed to prefer certain stones to others. The glass looked black and then looked like a deep color made from other colors. It drank light and then scattered it again in a way that made the men blink. The walls were close and then opened toward the middle as if the mountain had ribs. They moved in 2 and 2, the old habit of those who have learned that pairs are how you see forward and back at once. Davos went near the front. He had a hand that wanted to wipe on his cloak, but he told it not to. Old men who know their fear keep it like a pebble in their mouth and roll it around and get the flavor and swallow slowly. Jon walked behind Hob and watched how the man placed his feet. There was a way to step on glassy stone and even on the little scree of chips so that the foot did not skid. The trick was to let the ankle be intelligent. Jon told his ankles to think. They did. At a bend where the ceiling went low and the lantern called the rock down upon them, Hob stopped and held the lantern high. There were marks in the wall there, carved lines and circles and something like a wave. They were old enough that they had almost become part of the stone again. A man had stood here with a tool and taken hours and days to make these, sweating and cursing, and no one in the world would know his name. Jon did not know why he felt moved to put his palm to the rock near the marks. Not on them. He did it anyway. It was warmer there than a man expects rock to be and cooler too, in the sense that something very old is cooling the world by existing and very old heat warms it by breathing. Hob watched him and did not say the thing an old man says to a young one when he sees him trying to conjure. He only puffed a little through his nose as if in approval. Then they moved on. They came to the place where glass lay like a frozen river that had been persuaded to squeeze into a narrower channel. It had the rounded look of a thing that had once moved, and the memory of motion made a man uneasy. Hob touched it with the toe of his boot. "This lot is poor at the top," he said. "You have to go down into it and pry at the sides if you want good chunks. Up here it flakes and you get shards fit to put under a lord's pillow. Like, we'll start where we must and bring it up," Jon said. "Clubs, cloth for wrapping, sleds if we can build some small ones. How dangerous is this place?" Hob's grin took on a sly aspect. "Down where the deep runs are, you'll find holes where steam comes up and tells you that the mountain is thinking bad thoughts. You step over them and you keep moving. Up here as we are, the mountain is polite. You are more in danger from your own feet and your friend's clumsy elbow than from the old god under you." The men set to work with the careful force learned from hungry possession. They used iron to persuade stone, and then they used gentler tools to catch it. The first baskets were poor, full of small chips like charcoal. Then a man with long fingers and quiet feet found a seam that gave up a chunk as big as a man's forearm, and a sound went through them not unlike a murmur in a chapel. John took some weight, feeling the texture through the cloth, and put it into the basket like loot. After 2 hours, when sweat ran in lines through dust on foreheads and the lantern oil needed topping, a shout came down the tunnel like a word fallen from a high place. They froze the way men do in a cave when a sound comes that does not belong. Hop smiled. "Listen," he said. It wasn't a shout. It was a laugh. It had the sound of a woman's laugh, like a kettle thrown on and set to whisper. Then it turned and became the thin wail of a child. One of the men crossed himself with the gesture of a place that believed different things about different gods on different days. Hob rolled his eyes and made a gesture with a hand that looked like he was wiping a dirty plate. Davos looked at John. "The caves speak," he said quietly. "If a man comes here with loss, the caves tell him about it. If a man comes with hunger, they offer him hope and then take it away because they are caves and not our friends." John felt the sound inside the bones of his face and inside the hollows of his hands. He stood and let it run through him and come out the soles of his feet. "Do you hear something else?" he asked Hob. "Only the mountain saying what it always says," Hob replied, cheerful and grim. "It tells you that if you make a mistake here, no one will know where to light a candle. It tells you that if you do it right, you can haul enough of the black stone out to put between your ribs and something sharp someone else might try to put there. It tells a man that the world is old and he is not, and that he should hurry without running and look without staring." They brought up enough for 2 baskets that would fill the blademaker's bench for a day. The men took the baskets in turns and went up the hard way so the path would become muscle memory for them all. Hob nodded as each went past, counting without looking like he was counting. At the top, in the light that is not bright even at noon on a day like this, people looked the way people look when a new thing happens that could be a new food or a new beating. The fat woman took one look at the baskets and pointed at a boy who ran like grease to fetch a smith. The maester came back with paper to record. The old island kept itself through attention to small things. John found himself breathing in a rhythm with the place without meaning to. In the yard, a man stood with a cloak that had known too much rain and a pin on it that had not. The silver on the pin was both old and bright. He had a face that would have been pleasant had it not been organized by something like counted disappointment. When he turned and saw John with his hands on one basket, he bowed not all the way and not at all. "My lord," he said, and his eyes were very quick. "My name is Owain Valerion." He let the name sit for a heartbeat with the confidence of a man who knows the sound of his house opens doors. "We heard that someone had lit fires in the western keep, and that men had been seen on the steps with iron-shod boots, and that the old woman at the netmender's had found a letter stuck beneath the eaves by the wind. Driftmark has small ears that hear quickly." Driftmark thought, "We'd better go see who thinks he can make Dragonstone breathe again." "Valerion," Davos said under his breath, and aside to nobody and everybody. He had been to this island too often to count and had a map of its politics in his bones. He nudged John with only a look. "Be ready." John set the basket down on a cart and wiped his hands on his cloak. It left dull smears. He stepped forward not as a supplicant and not as a claimant, but as a man who had discovered that too much posture wastes strength. "You have come," he said. "We have come on behalf of what is ours," Owain said smoothly. "We have also come because we are curious. We are also here because we like to be first when there is news, because the first teller sets the price and the second teller begs a scrap." "You will tell," John said. "You will also listen. I have claimed this place because it is my right by blood, and because the place has a duty that nobody else has fulfilled, and because the duty it has matches the duty I have, and because my name, as most know, it has been a burden, and I am not ignorant that another name is being spoken in rooms with more light than comfort." Owain's eyes warmed by half a degree. He appreciated sentences like that. He had been raised on meals with knives in them. "Your blood," he said. That is a strong claim on this island and a weak one simultaneously. There are people with blood who thought themselves secure who found themselves ash on the wind for making that claim too loudly. I am making it as loud as is necessary and no louder, Jon said. That if you bring your ships and your men to me, we will not break them here, and when you need a harbor in a bad storm you will find one, and when you need justice you will find it written on wood and not on water. Justice written on wood is still only marks, Owain said gently. Then you might like me, Jon said, and he did not smile because he did not make friends with that part of his face. I do not write it without meaning to enforce it. I have learned the difference between words and eyes. I have learned to look at a man when I say a thing he will not like. Owain's own smile thinned. You are a Stark and a Targaryen then, at least in the ways that have mattered to people I have known. I am Jon, he said again. They spoke at length. The talk had the flow of the tide. It came in and retreated and left lines, and then returned with a different color in the water. Owain made his inquiries about storehouse levels, about the soundness of the piers down the east side, about the number of barrels of pitch in hand and whether the hooks along the cliff path had been replaced. These were not the questions of a mere gossip-monger. He was sounding the place like a captain taps a hull with a hammer. Jon answered and did not hide what was weak. There is a kind of strength in naming what needs work. Owain's eyes weighed that and found in it a kind of honesty rarer than cleverness. At last Owain nodded and tilted his head in a formal angle. I will tell them, he said. They will argue. They will look for people to test you. They will try to hire the stairs out from under you. It is what people do when they have made ships and fortunes from doing. But you will not see Valerian oars aimed at your men's heads. I do not like fire set to home walls. There are other ways to find who deserves a chair. You think this chair might be yours, Davos said mildly, and Owain did not even blush. He had been born to ambition the way some are born to tallness. He did not hear offense in being told what he knew about himself. I think all chairs are temporary, Owain said simply, which is why I prefer to sit on a deck. When he had gone, the yard seemed to settle as a story that had been told does. The wind lightened to a weak daylight. The men returned to their routines with the new slant of their shoulders that says, something important occurred, and we did not miss it. More letters arrived. One on thin, cheap paper that broke at the fold, from a minor house along the mainland coast that had been waiting for a chance to say it had recognized a real power before anyone else. One on thicker paper sealed with blue wax that had the stamp of a city's municipal sense of itself rather than a lord's human vanity. One that bore no seal and had been written by a person learning to write who could not keep to even lines and had the courage to write anyway. The last one asked whether the man who had come to the island would remember those who had been forced to leave it when old taxes had been called in all at once after a bad harvest. It had a tear stain on it, or perhaps it had been rained on. It is hard to tell with paper. Jon wrote replies in a hand that had become more legible since men had begun to hang on it with their hopes. He did not write long sentences. He said what he could promise. He did not promise what he wished. He signed Jon of Dragonstone, and then, in smaller letters beneath, Jon Snow. He did not sign Targaryen. He did not agree not to in the future if it proved a useful key to a necessary lock. He sent Davos to see to the runner's pay. Davos came back with a bag of coin that was lighter by far than the work to be done required. Davos and the fat woman and the maester sat with him by the hearth and made a list of what could be paid and what could be provided with goods and what could be promised in fish. We need the north, the maester said. We need everything the north is full of. Men who know work that is not only grudge and swagger. Meat, sinew, rope. Wood that cannot be found here in any length worthy of a ship's mast. We need ships. We need a fleet of ships if we are to be more than an island with a loud voice. The North owes me if I am owed, Jon said quietly, and I owe them so much that the ledgers will never balance. I will not strip them to build something here that is not returned to them by season's end. If this place becomes a pocket I turn out for my own comfort, I will have become the thing that made the world dangerous before Snow began to walk. Davos nodded slowly. He liked talk that had ash on it. Words that have seen fire sit differently. We'll ask for men who can be spared and who can spare themselves, he said. Not a levy. Volunteers. Men who do not mind stone under them and salt in them. Women who know how to take fish and render it and store it without losing half to rot. Families with a mind to start again where the wind will argue with them each day. People who know why that's worth it. The maester raised his eyebrows. You want to repopulate an island with people who are tired and dispossessed and stubborn, and who do not complain much because they know it does not help to complain. You will get an honest place. You will also get quarrels that begin with a glance and children who test stones with their heads. Islands raise their own kinds. So do walls, John said quietly. So do timber keeps. This place will put its hands on those who come. It will teach them to hold fast, or it will push them into the sea. We can set the hand that greets them before the sea gets its say. He walked the castle each day until his feet had learned it. He learned the secret path behind the chapel there, where a wind comes in that smells different, as if it had pushed through a thinner seam between worlds. He stood in the old rookery and thought how many letters had been sent by men who believed theirs would be the one to turn a mind or a kingdom. He sat on the low wall near the east buttress, where the wind strikes so hard it clears the fog for minutes at a time and shows a line of distant coast that is like a promised thing never delivered. He watched boys beat rugs and thought about what people will do to make a place livable that looks as if it doesn't want them. He learned the names of the kitchen girls who rolled their eyes at him for taking a plate and carrying it to the washing tubs, and he learned the name of the older man who had a limp and would not thank him for opening doors because gratitude made him feel small. He trained in the yard in cold wind and light snow, the way he had trained in yards besides for most of a life. The stomp of boots packed the snow in patches. He went against men who had the experience of keeping a blade up after the first pass or two left lungs dragging. His face changed as men found out time gets longer when you're being measured by someone who understands that measurement does not end with the blade's first taste. He did not show off. He did not let his eyes move away when he put a man to the ground with a twist and a heel. He helped him up. He chose those moments when leadership is shown to be labor and not posture, as carefully as a man places stones for a fire ring in a rough wind. After a week, Claw sent a cousin of the Lord who wore a hat too large for his head and liked to look at his own reflection in the polished shields that hung under the eaves of the armory. He made insinuations about taxes and the right way to keep accounts. For families, a pair of brothers with a donkey and 2 goats, an old woman with a baby whose mother had died in childbirth, 2 fishermen who could not fish where they had fished because a lord in that place had decided that the river's fish were his right for a time, a group of children like a small unruly pack, each with a different way of watching the world. John watched the first night as they were shown to a low hall, and as the fat woman did something with pots and herbs that turned a grim meal into a welcoming one. He watched a boy with ears too close to his head find a corner and make a space that he made his own by placing a folded cloth there and setting a small wooden soldier he had carved at the head of it like a watchman. He watched a girl who looked far more like his sister than he liked. Stubborn jaw, eyes that could laugh and cut in the same day. He walked away then because the thing that had risen in him at the sight needed to be put somewhere else where it would not pour out onto people and make their night strange. He wrote to the north again, this time with more certain hand. He said, "Send those who can do work in damp places and those who can be trusted with food in barrels. Send saplings. Send tools for stone and for rope. Send those who can make a lattice of wattle and daub in a day, and then make another and another for a haul that will keep the snow from killing people who have known too much snow already." He did not write, "Send my sisters." He did not write, "Keep them safe." He wrote where to put a tongue of salt on fish before drying so that it will not take on the flavor of the smoke alone, and where to find the seam in a hard rock to lever it open with wedges of wood poured with water to swell them. It was easier to write such things. There were nights when the wind went around the mountain and came back again and made a sound in the chimneys like a low animal, and those nights men remembered the dragons in stone and told each other what it had been like when they had breathed fire and judgment. John did not tell them not to. He understood that people need to tell stories about big shapes in the sky when their lives are full of small miseries. He did not encourage the stories either. He fed his people with work and with bread and with the sight of the baskets of black glass filling and filling again. In the yard the smith set up a table and began to flake and chip and shape. He cut his fingers the first day and swore and laughed, and then he kept a little lettuce leaf wrapped in cloth in his pocket to wrap the cuts in to keep the blood from making his grip slippery. One morning John found a bird dead in the corridor leading to the rookery. It had broken its neck against a paned window in a place where the glass was cleaner than in other places. He picked it up and turned it. It had gray feathers and a white belly and little feet stiff with cold. He thought of the birds that had carried letters that had carried men's desires and demands and deceits. He carried it out and gave it to the fat woman, who put it with 2 others. "It will be a pot pie," she said. "People will think it is a grander bird than it is, and they will be comforted more than they should be. This is not wrong. This is how cooking makes war on hard life." Word came like weather. It came of a woman with hair like coin who had landed to the south and was making a court like fire. It came of a boy with a name that had brought old men to their feet and made old women weep because they could not keep their husbands from kneeling to old pomps. It came of ships burning, of men standing on hills with banners and then not standing and then being left for the carrion. John learned to separate what he had to answer from what he had to note and put aside. He learned that even his quiet would be a kind of speech. He leaned on Davos and listened to what he said when other men had gone away and the old knight felt safe enough to let his truth out bare. He learned that a place where the stone breathes also teaches skill at breathing. He went again into the tunnels and this time deeper. He went with Hob and with 2 of the men who had learned their feat and with a rope around his waist and another around his wrist. Down there, the sound of the sea came through in odd ways, as if a cave mouth opened somewhere beneath where waves pushed in and out, the island drinking and exhaling at the same time. He felt the mountain's old fire as a warmth that was not comfort, like a fevered child's skin. They found a seam that had been missed by men before who had looked and not seen, and it gave up a length of glass the size of a man's leg, which they carried together and nearly failed to, and brought it to the surface and set it on a trestle as if it were a child who had been dragged out of a bad dream. The smith looked at it with the look a man gives an animal he hopes will not bite him. He touched it with a fingertip and then withdrew the finger and blew on it as if even that touch had cut. In the 3rd week, a ship came against a headwind with a stubbornness that made men say its captain was either courageous or desperate or both. It wore no colors until it came near. Then it hoisted a banner that had been used too often to be ceremonial. The blue wax and the municipal stamp had sent its larger cousin. A representative, a clerk, a man fat with the power to make a letter into food. He stood on the landing like a man who had found his gods to be smaller than his appetite. He came into the yard with a clerk's book and a court's voice and began to speak to the maester as if to an under-assistant. John watched and felt that long, old patience settle. He let the man spend himself on syllables until even the man heard the foolishness of a long sentence spoken to a stone that had watched kings break. When he paused to breathe, John said, "You are in the yard of a place that has outlasted the decisions of men like you many times over." The clerk blinked and then smiled. He had learned in Psalm school somewhere that a smile was a softer weapon that made a wound in smaller cuts. "And yet, my lord, it is men like me who make this place's stones into bread." "Not always," John said. "Sometimes it is women like the one in the kitchen. Sometimes it is boys who carry wood in sleet. Sometimes it is old men who find what they are good for is counting baskets and saying no to those who would take them without being asked." He gave him a tour, and that was more effective than the best argument. He took him into the storehouse where the barrels held fish cured in new salt and not yet old enough to be called good. He took him to the armory where a new rack held daggers with edges so fine they looked like nothing until they kissed a strip of leather and left it become 2 smaller things. He took him to the side of the mountain where a shed had been built in 3 days by women with hands that could part and tie rope in wind. He took him to the schoolroom the kitchen women had started with chalk on slate. Letters for the children who had come in numbers 2, and the names of birds that came here and couldn't find the open sea and died and went into pies. The clerk put his hand to the back of his neck as if he had a sudden ache and then saw that he had and that it was shame, and took his hand down. "You will have what you need and what you ask for and what we agree I can spare," he said at the end, with a clarity that surprises men when they hear themselves speak it. "And we will not argue about whose seal is on the paper. You will, however, send men to sit at tables and count with me." "We will," John said. We have more men who can count than you think. They all learned because counting is how you stay ahead of hunger. After the man left, Davos stood with Jon under the eave of the armory and watched the sea. The old knight pushed his chin into his scarf and said, "You're doing it." "Doing what?" Jon asked, because it keeps a man honest to make someone say what he praises. "Turning your list into a place," Davos replied. "Turning your fear into a shape other men can hold. Turning an old mountain into a thing that breathes for the living and not for their memories." Jon didn't answer. Men who believe too quickly they are doing a thing well begin to do it poorly. He watched the line of foam where the current met the outflow from under the cliff and thought about the breath of hot air they had felt in the tunnel and how it had smelled and how a place like this keeps its secrets until it decides to show them all at once. A raven came that evening with a band on its leg that Jon recognized by the way the metal had been hammered. The letter tied to it was on thick paper, with a hand different from the bookish man. It had written only a few sentences. Said, "I am glad you did not drown." It said, "It is strange to write your new name when I have only just accepted your old one." It said, "Send me what you think I should know and I will send you what I know." It was signed with a name that he had known as a boy and now knew as a woman who would not be told what to do and had taught herself what to write. He set the letter down and did not sit. He went to the wall and watched the night gather, the way it gathers on the sea with a breadth that planes cannot achieve. He felt a stirring in himself that was hope, but he didn't let it run. He let it lie and breathe like the sea, rise and fall, and not drown him. In the morning, a storm came in fast and tight, a knot of wind and rain and snow at once, a storm that smelled like old ice and old gales and old fire all crowded into the same little space. The island's dragons took the weather on their fixed faces. The men pulled their cloaks close. The children laughed because storms give them permission to shout. In the tunnels, lanterns were secured and work was halted. The fat woman made a soup that lasted all day and was never the same at any point because she kept adding this and that came to hand. The wind pushed at the parapets and rattled in a seam in the stone and made a song that some men called omen and some called simply wind. Jon went to the long room with the map and sat in the low light while rain beat itself against the shutters. He put his hand on the place where Dragonstone lay and then on the place where Winterfell would be. He did not close his eyes. He did not need to imagine the in-between. He had lived in it. He let the sound of the storm fill him. He let his breath find the long, slow rhythm that the storm permitted. He had learned to breathe where there is not enough air. He could breathe here. The maester came and hovered and then sat, a habit he had developed because he knew some men feel crowded by a gray presence and yet want its company. "We could," he began and stopped. "We could send a letter to the woman with the fire court," he said, surprising himself with daring. "We could say, 'There is a man who has the rock that used to be your people's. He promises not to burn your men if you promise not to drown his.'" Jon did not reply for a time. The fire court, hair like coin, men who had followed the belief that a different season could be coaxed out of the world by the will of one. He knew he could be drawn into their shape and be used for fuel. He also knew he could not avoid certain currents. "We will send a letter," he said. "We will say, 'There is a man here who will not bend easily and who will not break uselessly.' We will say, 'If you come, you will be received as someone who wants to live and not as someone who wants to set the island on fire so the night looks better against your hair.'" The maester's mouth opened and shut and then opened. He had never imagined wording like that being sent to any person called Queen. He half wanted to write it. He half wanted to be safe the rest of his life, and knew the second part would not be delivered to him. They wrote. They wrote to the north and to the south and the East Islands and to the cities that think themselves more than cities. They wrote to men who would ignore them and to women who would smile and set the letters under a wine cup until the bottom of the cup glued the letter to the wood. They wrote to nobles who would pretend outrage and farmers who would read every line twice and then carry every word to a neighbor and ask whether the neighbor had read between them with the same care. They wrote to a few priests against Jon's desire because the maester insisted polite piety made trade easier in places where gods are easily flattered. Days became the kind of days that work uses to harden men. You do a small thing and then another and there is no great satisfaction in anyone. And then the evening meal is better than last week's and there are fewer coughs in the children and a small jape goes around about Hobbs' one tooth and whether it is more honest than the whole mouth of a certain clerk. And somehow these small things slow time until one day you realize the place is different than when you came. The island's breath continued. The storms rolled and unrolled. The dragons stood. He dreamed sometimes that he climbed the stair and there was another stair behind it that he had not seen. It went down instead of up. It went down into a place where it was not heat that made the air breathe but cold, and where glass could be made and unmade like a thought. He would wake with his hand on the hilt of his sword and then laugh at himself quietly in the dark because some habits follow a man into rooms where swords cannot answer. He told himself that dream did not foretell. It reminded, one late afternoon, when the sky had given itself the color of bruised fruit and the wind had settled for a time like a dog unwillingly called in from a hunt. A boy came up from the stair too fast and then remembered to slow because men dislike running in courtyards unless there is fire. He stood before John and swallowed air in big bites and said, "Sails from the east 3. One with a squint, one with a slant, one with a split. The first has more oars than a necessary man would have." John went to the wall and took the glass eye and let the sea come near. The boy's sense of ship's eyes was not bad. The first had oars knifing the water as if the captain disbelieved wind existed. The second angled. The third seemed embarrassed by its own ragged sail. He felt Davos at his shoulder before he heard him. "The old nights I went narrow. That cut of prow," he said. "That swagger of deck. Might be raiders. Do we have fire for the pitch?" John asked, and the old habit of immediate inventory took him like a muscular memory. "Do we have men on the stairs? Do we have enough arrows to make them thoughtful? We have enough to make them choose a different landing if they were thinking of trying the main one." Davos set his hands on the parapet. "If they're from where I think they like to peel people like fruit to see what sort of man they are inside. They can be clever and they can be mad and they are more often both. Send word to the lower landing," John said. "Send men with their faces covered. Not to look frightening. To keep the wind out of their mouths so their breath is good when they need it. Put kettles to swing. Tell the children to go into the rooms along the inner wall and then count again. Tell the fat woman to take down the black cloth from over last year's barrels and use it to cover the firewood so the rain doesn't make us curse after the fight. Set Hob at the second landing with 6 men with clubs. He looks like a man and then he isn't, he's a rock, and rocks scare people who rely on the feel of blood under a knife." Davos nodded. He liked being told to do the things he would have done if not told. It meant he was working with someone whose mind and his had found some harmony. "And you?" he asked. "I'll go to the lower stair," John replied. "If they speak sense, I'll hear it. If they speak knives, I'll answer." The first ship slowed as if it had decided that discretion was a better posture than conversation. The second made as if to peel off and run along the cliff for a better look. The third came on. It had desperation in it, the way a poor cousin has in a good room. John stood on the landing with 6 men whose eyes did not skitter, and the sea looked as if it wished to eat the steps. The first sight of the raiders, if raiders they were, told him something else. Their blankets were patched not to show indifference, but because fixing had been a way of living for a long time. Their captain, when he stood, did not strut. He had a look of a man who had been told 3 different master plans and had to pretend all 3 were his idea. "What is your business?" John called in a voice that he had used between mountains and over ice, carried without him hurting it. The captain answered in a tongue that had been borrowed poorly from a better one and used to trade fish for wine for generations. "Shelter," he called, "and trade. Shelter for trade. We heard there's a man on the rock who wants to make sharp glass. We've got things to carry the glass away on and things to put on the ends of it and things to feed the men who do the work. We've got nothing to win by dying on your stair." John looked at Davos. The old knight had the half-smile that says a man is pleased his memory was right, but not pleased that it gives him bad choices to make. "Give them the second stair," Davos said. "Not the main. Make them climb. Men who would rather climb than die are men who might keep a bargain. Men who insist on the easy path are men who will take your throat when you lean away to scratch." They let the third ship in. The men who came up wore their knives poorly, low, ready to be shown off, ready to be used to cut food, ready to be used to cut throats. Jon watched their eyes and didn't let them see his watch, but men who have lived by reading others can tell when they are being read. The captain held up empty hands and let his sleeves fall back to show no hidden slim blades. He had scars like ripples across one forearm, the kind a man gets when a rope goes wrong. Inside, in a room without windows and with a low ceiling, they spoke, and it had the feel of a negotiation between old enemies who wished to be new friends. The captain wanted glass and a little lordly favor he could carry back, a sentence he could make into a title among his people for the sake of order. Jon wanted food and rope and strong hands that could keep their discipline when the mountain breathed oddly. They worked like men mending a net, with an understanding of when to knot and when to leave slack. The captain agreed to leave his knives at the door when he came to talk and to take his shoes off to show his feet were not filled with blades. It was not a humiliation because Jon took off his own, and because the room was warmed by the island's breath, and because the fat woman came in and put bowls on the table and hit the captain on the shoulder when he made to take the biggest bowl. He laughed without offense. Men are made smaller by a certain kind of room. They are made better. After the men had gone, after they had passed kettles that had not been used and stairs that had not been spilled on with blood, Jon let out the breath he had carried. He looked at Davos and found his own relief mirrored there like a ship in a calm pool. "There will be others," Davos said. "Yes," Jon replied. "We will be ready to fight and we will be ready to bargain. Either one done poorly will be the death of us. Either one done too often will be the ruin of us." Night came and snow freshened the ledges. The fat woman made a pie with 3 birds in it, as promised. It was delicious beyond its parts, and people forgot for an evening what their losses had taught them they must remember. The children were allowed to sit near the hearth without scold. Hobb told a story that had a dragon in it that behaved politely in a way no dragon ever had and then learned not to, and everyone laughed because even lies can tell you truths. That you want the strong to be kind and they never are, not when they are strong in old ways. He slept that night as hard as if he had been beaten. In the morning, early, the maester came in with a letter on paper that looked expensive because it was the kind that thinks it is above the work of carrying words. He held it as one holds a small animal. "This," he said with controlled triumph, "is from a hand whose ink I would know even if it had been spilled from a boat into a storm and then used to write on a piece of sail." He gave it to Jon. It was from the woman with the fire court. It was brief and it did not kneel and it did not demand kneeling. Said, "The rock is full of old breath. Do not think it is yours because you can feel it." It said, "If you are what you say, we share blood, though it has come to us down different rivers." It said, "I will come when I am ready to come. Act as if I am already in the room, and you will not disappoint me when I arrive." It said, "Do not burn the world in my name as others have burned it for their names." It had a signature that was practiced but had an honest flaw in the curve of one letter. The hand of someone who had learned early to write before she should have had to and never had a teacher correct that one small thing. Jon read it twice and then a third time to find the place where pride asked to be flattered. He left that part unacknowledged. He wrote back, "The rock is not mine. I am making it a place where the living can stand. If you come with fire, I will not leave with ashes. If you come with claims, I will listen. If you come with need, I have it also." He put down the pen and set his hands flat on the table and felt the wood's argument with his palms. He felt the island under him. He felt the sea. He felt the long weight of his own self, the coat and the shirt beneath the coat, the fool's cloth others wanted to drape over either. Outside, men were moving barrels. Children were learning their letters. A young woman was teaching a boy how to weave rope with his teeth and his 2 good fingers because the others had been lost in a trap. Hobb was pouring oil into a lamp as tenderly as a father pours soup into a child. Davos was scowling at a ledger and laughing at his own scowl, a habit he had developed to save his face from being stuck that way. The mountain breathed. He breathed, slow, deliberate. He placed his hand again on the north on the table. He placed his hand on Dragonstone. He placed his mind in the space between and made the bridge as carefully as he knew how. The day could begin. The work was endless. That meant there was purpose in it. He went to it,